Welcome to Poetic Technique. Today we'll be talking about the ode. I would like to speak briefly about the specific properties of the ode before we consider some of its varieties. I'll begin by speaking about expected features of the ode. Following that, I'll talk about some of the origins of the genre, as seen in Enheduanna, the Homeric hymns, Pindar, Horace, and then we'll conclude by looking at some of the developments of the ode, both in the Romantics and in modern and contemporary poetry. This one's going to be a little bit more lecture-y than the videos I typically make, just because I have a lot of material to cover and I want to make sure that I do it quickly. So I'll begin with two observations. First, that when we think about this genre, we typically think of it in terms of the following structure. We have the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. The structure is, of course, it's only one of the origins, and it's kind of a waning inheritance of the genre in contemporary genres, or in contemporary odes. But its origins are in the Pindaric odes, which are designed for choric song and dance. They're choruses, and as such, the strophe represents a metrical structure that follows a dance pattern. The antistrophe represents a reversal of that dance pattern, and then the epode, diverges from that or synthesizes the two. Of course, Pindar himself didn't invent this variation of the genre. Rather, he drew on previous versions of this structure and also some of his contemporaries. But Pindar's odes, used in conjunction with the Olympic Games, are some of the most lasting of this genre. So for the first observation, we think about one structure among many. I'll further discuss a few other versions here shortly. My second observation is this. Prominent qualities of the ode transcend time. They operate outside of poetic lineage and inheritance. And what I mean by this is we see similar structures in Enheduanna's temple hymns, in the Shijing, or the Chinese Book of Songs, and elsewhere, in this despite continental divides. To explore this thesis a little bit, I'll briefly discuss a few of the qualities that we see in originary odes, such as those of Enheduanna's. With each of her temple hymns, Enheduanna articulates the specific qualities and the dominions of the portrayed deities in the poems themselves. These deities represent some elements of the civilizations. They make the invisible visible. These hymns, her hymns, are apostrophic. The temples themselves are addressed, and they often end with a sort of formula, a formulaic closing, which usually goes along the lines of like, oh, and then the god's name, built this house on your site and placed a seat upon your dais, or day. So what's the significance of these observations? Well, first, that there are conventions in place, despite these hymns being the first of their kind to be recorded. As such, the fact that we see many of these qualities in other odes and on other continents, in other ages, things like apostrophe, the invocation of the deity, praise of the deity, qualities of the divine, and the symbolic relationship between a deity and some invisible aspect of nature or of humankind. Well, these things suggest that there's something not inherited through written literature, or perhaps there's maybe something intrinsic to the act of praise or celebration or meditation. We see similar qualities in the Homeric hymns. These hymns follow a basic structure. They begin with an invocation of a deity, perhaps lead with an epithet. They provide some statement on or narrative of the deity's acts. They petition said deity for a favor, and then they vow some future service to that god. We can think about the promise, I will never stop singing hymns for Apollo. It's one example of guarantees that if the god provides favor to the poet, they'll return that favor somehow. So let's take a moment to see how this takes shape in the first poem in our packet, which is Hymn to Aphrodite. What do we see? Well, right off the bat, the speaker establishes his occasion with an epithet. He says, I shall sing of the Cytherean. The Cytherean is an epithet for Aphrodite. The occasion is song. And then we have a quick catalog of acts and descriptions. Aphrodite gives gentle gifts. Her face is always smiling. And in the penultimate stanza, we see a petition. Grant me an enchanting song. In other words, let me be a good poet. And it ends with a promise. I shall remember you. Let me be a good poet and I shall remember you. And another song too. And then it goes on to talk about another deity. So these conventions are typical to the Homeric hymn and can be traced through Pindar. They also stand in contrast to another type of ode, which is the Horatian ode. Horatian odes meditate on a serious subject, such as war. For instance, we can think of that famous line, dulce et decorum et pro patria est pro patria mori, or it is sweet and right to die for one's country. These poems are not derived from Pindar, and they're not intended to be public utterances on the occasion of a game. Rather, they are derived from the influence of Sappho, and similarly are private utterances, even if they're addressed to a specific recipient. When we consider these traditions, then we see two primary avenues through which to consider the ode, the private versus the public, the Horatian generally versus the Pindaric. The temple hymns and Homeric hymns are public utterances, the Horatian odes are private utterances. And whereas the mentioned odes have for their occasions things like songs, petitions, games, didacticism, serious contemplation, when we move forward in time and we look at the Romantic poets, we see a totally different occasion for the ode. For the Romantics, the occasion is often a vocational or an existential crisis. Some of these odes, well, we think about them beginning with Coleridge's Dejection ode, Wordsworth's ode, Intimations of Mortality. These two poems take as their subject serious contemplation in the vein of the Horatian ode, but their occasion emphasizes the inner, the psychological and the emotional. They're concerned with existential crises. Wordsworth, in a letter concerning his poem, writes about how as a child he couldn't conceive of death as something that would apply to him. He couldn't admit that it was a possibility. In Intimations, then, he picks up on this consideration, and he departs from traditional theistic worldviews and instead speaks from the position of a personal and romantic philosophy. He writes, "Our birth is but a sleep and a forgetting." So this means life is temporary, it's fleeting. This type of consideration, this specific consideration, provides for the occasion of a poem that, in keeping with tradition, includes some of these conventions we've mentioned, things like apostrophic addresses. And because my favorite Romantic poet is Keats, I want to, his odes are some of my favorite poems of all time. I'd like to take a look at his poems. Kind of like Wordsworth's existential concern with mortality, Keats picks up on the personal, the emotional, the psychological, and the internal. His are deeply personal poems. They're private in occasion. They don't consider an external human addressee. In Ode to a Nightingale, for example, the addressee is the nightingale. In Ode on Melancholy, the addressee is the self. In Ode on a Grecian Urn, his acrostic ode, the addressee are the figures, the art figures on the urn itself. And then we have, what other poem do we have? We have To Autumn, which is a pastoral ode, and the addressee is the season, autumn. One of the things I want to note in Keats's ode is kind of the prominence of personal ambition. It's a super important concern of his. And ambition is, of course, traditionally inextricable from the genre of the ode. Enheduanna establishes herself as high priestess and an indispensable mediator between the worshippers and their deities. Pindar makes his living off of writing his poems for patrons, for nobility. Keats aims to create his legacy through the odes that he made by considering the form of the sonnet. Like the sonnets, his odes are arguments. I'm just going to have to kind of choose one so we can look at it a bit more closely, maybe appreciate some of the elevated psychology we see in his poems. Let's check out Ode to a Nightingale. What do we see there? Well, we have a common odic object. And by odic object, I mean the object on which the focus of the poem is projected. And this common odic object is the bird. Whereas in the odic inheritances that we see in epics or in Pindar, things like heroes, sportsmen, exquisite craft work, which are all exceptional objects, Keats puts forth the unexpected as the focus of his meditations. He focuses on an insignificant figure for a very serious contemplation. Similarly, instead of writing an ode to spring, which is something you'd expect out of an ode, it's more worth celebrating. Spring is a season of life. Keats writes his ode to autumn. This kind of imbues the unappreciated season with more significance. Think not of them, thou hast thy music too, the speaker says. What is the occasion of Ode to a Nightingale? Acedia. Keats is depressed. He's writing into and about his feelings. He speaks of a quote, drowsy numbness that he feels, and he likens it to having taken a sedative drug. He's seeking a way out of his feelings. He says, oh, for a draught of vintage. Oh, for a bottle of wine. Keats takes expectations for the ode, an elevated occasion, and odic object, and he subverts them to focus on the self, to look inward, to quite romantically dissolve the boundaries between the self and one's environment. His legacy has impacted the ode since. His use of the common as an odic object as opposed to the elevated reverberates through time, through modern contemporary poetry. We looked at Frank O'Hara's poem Today, in which he celebrates the everyday. Similarly, Lucille Clifton writes poems to her uterus and to her last period. Sharon Olds' odes use as their objects common items, things like cloth, and they praise things like parts of the body, the clitoris, weathered cleavage. And as a last consideration, Yusuf Komunyaka's Ode to the Maggot achieves a pretty deep and serious meditation on mortality through a most common odic object, which is the maggot. What each of the just mentioned odes achieves is a reconsideration of objects that are worth praising or worth considering deeply. Unlike the odes that associate their objects with the divine, modern contemporary odes in an era where Nietzsche would say God is dead, a time where Roland Barthes would say the author is dead, a time when or after the atom bomb has kind of taken beauty with it and taken the beauty of art with it, serious contemplation is reached through common objects. God is dead, the everyday provides a material worth celebrating. The commonplace allows atheist and agnostic poets to write and praise and delight in the beauty of life because of the fact of impermanence. To conclude this video, let's take a look at Yusuf Komunyaka's brilliant poem, Ode to the Maggot. Ode to the Maggot. Brother of the blowfly and Godhead, you work magic over battlefields and slabs of bad pork and flop houses. Yes, you go to the root of all things. You are sound and mathematical. Jesus Christ, you're merciless with the truth. Ontological and lustrous, you cast spells on beggars and kings behind the stone door of Caesar's tomb, or split trench in a field of ragweed. No decree or creed can outlaw you, as you take every living thing apart, little master of earth. No one gets to heaven without going through you first. Unlike the Olympian, whose inheritance is primarily associated with the divine, the maggot is associated both with the basest and the highest possible relations, the blowfly and the Godhead. Like the romantic ode, this is an isolated speaker addressing a non-human entity and using that entity as a mask for the self, as a way to meditate deeply through an external odic object. In this way, the meditation is Horatian. It's lyric, private, tranquil, contemplative. Unlike Horace and Hedwana or Pindar, however, this ode has death for a god. Death alongside the most basic of objects becomes divine, becomes something worth noting, becomes greater through the meditation. So, when you choose to write an ode in the 21st century, these are your inheritances. We have poems of serious contemplation and poems of celebration, poems written in private and poems written for public utterance. You can take the Pindaric structure of the ode in mind, strophe, antistrophe, epode, or you can focus on the way that an ode might try to resolve some sort of psychological crisis in the vein of the romantic ode by projecting meaning, projecting that crisis outward onto an object, attempting to resolve the personal, the inner, the psychological crisis through metaphor, through projection. Quick and dirty look at the ode. That's it for the intro. Let's try to engage some of these parts in the conversations that we have, either in your comments below or if you're registered in my class on Canvas. Thank you.